There's a saying my grandfather used to repeat every time the news got bad. He'd sit in that old wooden chair by the window, the one with the cracked armrest that nobody ever fixed, and he'd look out at whatever sky was available to him, and he'd say, "The ones who leave you alone when you're bleeding are never the ones you forget, and the ones who stayed, you repay them with everything." I didn't understand what he meant when I was 9. I didn't understand what he meant when I was 19, either. I was 34 years old, standing on the observation deck of the ISV Kestrel unmarked, watching a blue-white planet rotate slowly beneath a field of stars, before I finally understood. And by then, it was already almost too late to repay anyone anything. Let me back up. Let me start from the part that matters. The year the Galactic Concordance made first contact with Earth, I was 11 years old and living in a mid-sized city in the northern part of a country that doesn't exist anymore, not politically anyway. The borders changed. They do that after contact. Everything changes after contact. I remember the day because my mother burned the toast. That sounds stupid. It sounds like the wrong thing to remember. But that's the thing about real memories. They don't organize themselves around what's important. They organize around sensory detail. Around the smell of scorched bread and the sound of the emergency broadcast cutting through the morning radio, a tone so unfamiliar and urgent that my mother actually dropped the spatula. It clattered on the kitchen tiles. We stood there, me in my school uniform with one sock still in my hand, her in her bathrobe, and we listened. The voice on the radio was calm in the way that people are calm when they've been trained to stay calm regardless of what they're reading. It said that spacecraft of unknown origin had entered Earth's orbital atmosphere at 17 points simultaneously. It said there was no cause for immediate alarm. It said the governments of several nations were already in communication with what appeared to be, and I remember this phrase exactly because I repeated it to myself about 40 times that morning. A coordinated extraterrestrial delegation. My mother picked up the spatula. She scraped the burned toast over the sink. She said, "Eat something, you'll still have school." I did not have school. Nobody had school that week. The Galactic Concordance we would learn over the following months was not one species. It was 47. A coalition stretching across what they called the Settled Rim, a band of star systems that had been in contact with each other for somewhere between 600 and 800 years, depending on which species you asked and how they measured time. They were not invaders. They were very clear about this. They had a delegation structure, a legal framework, a shared language called Concordance Standard that had been specifically engineered to be learnable by most species with bilateral symmetry and a vocalization-based communication system. They had diplomats. They had protocols. They had, as far as anyone could determine, genuinely good intentions. What they also had was a policy. The policy had a formal name in Concordance Standard that translated roughly as observed non-interference with developing civilizations. But the human press, which has never met a term it couldn't abbreviate, just called it the hands-off protocol. The hands-off protocol was simple. If a civilization had not yet achieved stable faster-than-light travel, and Earth had not even close, we were still arguing about whether the prototype drives were theoretically possible. The Concordance would make contact, establish diplomatic relations, offer limited cultural exchange, and then essentially leave you alone. Not hostile, not dismissive, just apart. They would not share their technology. They would not offer military alliance. They would not intervene in internal planetary conflicts. They would observe. They would communicate. They would be, in their own careful and diplomatic way, polite. But they would not help. My grandfather heard about the hands-off protocol and laughed in a way that wasn't funny at all. 47 species, he said, and they all agreed to watch. He was 61 years old. He remembered things that I didn't, things that made him read the word protocol with a particular kind of bitterness. I want to be fair to the Concordance. I've had 23 years now to think about this, and I've met enough Concordance citizens, Velhari, Daskem, Esrathi, the tall, gray carapaced ones whose name I still cannot pronounce correctly, to understand that the hands-off protocol wasn't cruelty. It wasn't indifference, not entirely. It was, from their perspective, a lesson learned. Several member species had their own histories of intervention, of arriving at developing worlds with good intentions and leaving behind dependency, disruption, collapse. The Velhari, who were the closest thing the Concordance had to founding members, had intervened in the development of two pre-FTL civilizations in their own early expansion period. One of those civilizations had, within 2 generations of Velhari technological transfer, collapsed into factional warfare over control of the new systems. The other had simply stopped developing their own science. Why would they? The Velhari had all the answers already. So the Concordance drew up the protocol, and they applied it to everyone, including us, during the 15 years that turned out to matter most. I was 11 when they arrived. I was 14 when the Pacific Thermal Cascade started, the climate event that the models had been predicting for decades, the one that every major government had been told was coming, the one that nobody with power had done quite enough about because the timeline was always later, until suddenly it was now. I was 16 when the second cascade began, the one in the Atlantic corridor. I was 19 when the food systems started breaking. Not everywhere. That's the thing people don't always understand when they read the history now. It wasn't uniform. Parts of the planet were fine. Parts were not fine in ways that are difficult to describe without sounding like you're being dramatic. But I promise you, there was nothing dramatic about it. Dramatic implies spectacle. What happened in those years was quieter than that. It was ordinary suffering at a scale that made the word ordinary feel like a crime. I watched it, I was in it. My mother spent 4 years working for a regional food distribution organization that was perpetually underfunded and perpetually overwhelmed. She came home tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. I helped where I could. I was 19 and then 20 and then 22, and I worked, and I watched, and I thought about those 47 species sitting in their ships or on their worlds observing. Not helping. Observing. The Concordance maintained a small diplomatic station in orbit, the Concordance Proximity Outpost, which humans immediately nicknamed the Porch because it sat just outside our reach, and that felt right. Their representatives came down occasionally for formal exchanges. They were unfailingly polite. They expressed what translated as sympathy regarding our developmental challenges. There was a press conference I watched when I was 21. A Velhari representative, tall, pale-feathered, with those strange forward-tilted eyes that always looked like they were solving an equation, stood at a podium next to the UN Secretary General and answered questions. A journalist asked directly, could the Concordance not share even basic atmospheric management technology, given the scale of what was happening? The Velhari representative's translation came through the earpieces with a slight lag. The protocol exists to protect civilizations in your position from dependencies that would ultimately harm your development. We understand this is difficult to hear. The Concordance expresses its sincere regard for the people of Earth during this challenging period. Sincere regard. I turned off the feed. Aye. Here is what I want you to understand about the next part. When I tell you what humans did during those 15 years, I want you to hear it the right way. Not as triumph, not as a montage, not as something with a swelling musical score behind it. I want you to hear it the way it actually happened, which was slowly and painfully and without any guarantee that it would work. The first breakthrough came from a research collective in what had been southern Brazil, a loosely affiliated group of about 200 scientists, engineers, and frankly just talented and stubborn people, working with equipment that was mostly repurposed and partly improvised, funded by a patchwork of national governments, private donors, and what I can only describe as institutional stubbornness. They cracked the atmospheric stabilization problem. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. They found a method for accelerated carbon sequestration using modified deep ocean microbial systems that nobody had thought to combine in quite that way before. It worked. It took 8 years to scale. Those 8 years were brutal, but it worked. I was 27 when the Pacific Stabilization Indices started showing consistent improvement. I remember where I was. I was in a distribution center on the coast, helping sort inventory that my mother's organization was moving north. Someone's radio was on. The announcement came through, the UN Climate Monitoring Division reporting a statistically significant reversal in the primary thermal indices. The woman next to me, her name was Farid, She was from somewhere east. She had the most tired eyes I had ever seen on a person my age. Looked at the radio. Looked at me. She didn't say anything. She just nodded once, like okay, okay. We kept sorting. The second breakthrough was the drives. This one I knew more about, because by the time it happened I had managed to attach myself, through a combination of aerospace engineering credentials and an aggressive willingness to take whatever contract work was available, to the research consortium that eventually became the United Earth Propulsion Laboratory. The theory for stable, faster-than-light travel had existed for decades. The Alcubierre framework, extended and modified and argued over by 3 generations of theoretical physicists. The problem wasn't the theory. The problem was the energy requirement, which was, in the original calculations, roughly equivalent to converting a small moon. The breakthrough, and I was there when it happened. I was 29 years old sitting in a monitoring bay on what was supposed to be a routine calibration run. The breakthrough was that it didn't need to be a moon. The lead engineer on that project was a quiet woman named Dr. Margit Vass, Hungarian by birth, Martian station raised, who communicated primarily through equations and the occasional devastatingly dry comment. She had been working on the energy compression problem for 11 years. She had a habit of tapping her thumbnail against her front teeth when she was thinking. I heard that tapping stop, and then I heard her say very quietly, "Oh, that's what we were missing." The room got very still. The new energy architecture she'd identified reduced the requirement by a factor of roughly 900. It was still enormous by any ordinary standard, but it was achievable. It was achievable. I was 31 when the ISV Pathfinder made its first successful faster-than-light transit. Unmanned. 47 light minutes there, 47 light minutes back. A round trip that conventional drives would have taken months and took instead just under 11 hours. The Concordance proximity outpost had been watching. We knew they were watching. We didn't perform it for them. We didn't do it at them. But we knew they were watching, and I think every person in the UEPL that night thought about the same thing, thought about 15 years of sincere regard and developmental challenges, and the protocol exists to protect, and felt something complicated that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite grief. It was all 3, sort of. It was the feeling you get when you've done something very hard without any help, and you've done it, and you're glad you did it, and you're also exhausted in a way that you haven't yet given yourself permission to fully feel. I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. "We did it," I said. There was a pause. "I know," she said. "It's on the news." Another pause. "Your grandfather would have had something to say about that," she said. "He'd have had a lot to say," I said. We both laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed like that in a long time, the kind of laugh that has some crying in it. IV. The Concordance made contact within 72 hours of the Pathfinder transit. Their message was formal, warm in the calibrated way of Concordance diplomatic language, and notable for what it included that their previous communications had not. An invitation. Not to visit, not yet. An invitation to apply, to begin the formal process of membership candidacy in the Galactic Concordance. The hands-off protocol, they explained, applied to pre-FTL civilizations. We were, as of the Pathfinder transit, no longer in that category. The world had a lot of feelings about this. I had specific feelings about it. I want to be careful here, because I've given a version of this speech before, and it's easy to make it sound simpler than it was. The Concordance was not evil. The protocol was not malicious. The species on the other side of that invitation were genuinely, I believe, acting according to their best understanding of what was ethical. But I also knew what those 15 years had cost. I knew the faces I'd seen in distribution centers. I knew the research teams that had worked themselves half to death on equipment that better funding might have replaced years earlier. I knew the communities that hadn't made it through the climate years intact. I knew my mother's eyes at the end of those shifts. And I knew, because I had studied the Concordance member species' histories, because I had read everything available about them, that some of those 47 species had technologies 15 years ago that could have meaningfully helped. Atmospheric management systems, climate modeling tools, agricultural resilience frameworks, Nothing that would have given us FTL that we needed to get ourselves, and I think on some level I understood that. But things that could have softened the edges. Things that could have meant fewer people in those distribution lines. They hadn't offered. Because of the protocol, I was selected for the first contact mission, the first actual crewed mission that would transit to concordance space, through a process that I won't pretend was straightforward. It involved politics and institutional maneuvering, and at least 2 arguments I had with people significantly above my pay grade that probably should have ended my career. They didn't, apparently. My role was listed as Technical Systems Observer. In practice, I was there because I had been present for every major propulsion development milestone, because I spoke passable concordance standard, one of maybe 60 humans on Earth who did, at the time, and because I had a reputation for staying calm in unfamiliar situations. That last part was a polite way of saying I was hard to rattle. Which was true, or had been, before I actually stood on the Kestrel Unmarked's observation deck and watched the stars. The Kestrel Unmarked was our second FTL-capable ship. The name was a running joke among the crew. It was very much marked. It had 17 different flags painted on its hull. It was the single most visibly identified human vessel that had ever existed. The name was chosen by the mission commander, Captain Adiz Okonkwo, who had a sense of humor that was either completely dry or didn't exist, and I was never fully certain which. We had a crew of 22 humans, and for the transit, a small concordance diplomatic escort, 3 Velhari and 1 Esrath, who had volunteered to accompany us as navigational liaisons. Their names were, in the human phonetic approximations that made them actually sayable, Thesson, Vorik, Palat Margin, and the Esrathi who went by a human nickname, 8, because his actual name involved subsonic tonal components our ears couldn't reliably distinguish. 8 was my favorite, immediately and without competition. He was roughly the shape and height of a very large dog if a very large dog had 6 limbs and moved like water. He communicated partly through concordance standard and partly through patterns of bioluminescent color that flickered along his dorsal ridge. His default color when at rest was a soft amber, the color of old honey. When he was amused, which happened more than the Velhari seemed comfortable with, it went to a deep, pulsing blue-green that I found profoundly calming. He found humans fascinating. "You developed FTL without reference to any existing framework," he said to me once, the translation device doing its careful work, while we were both standing at the viewport. "Every species I know of who achieved it was at least partially informed by contact with another species' theoretical work. You did it from your own mathematics." "We didn't have another option," I said. He flickered amber blue, thoughtful. "No, that is what is interesting. The Kestrel Unmarked arrived in concordance space after a transit that took, subjectively, about 9 hours, and was objectively the strangest 9 hours of my life. I'll spare the technical description of what FTL transit actually feels like because I've given that account in formal reports that you can find if you want them, and this isn't that. What I'll say is that there's a moment, right at the edge of transit initiation, where the stars stop making sense for just a fraction of a second. A half moment where everything is slightly wrong and slightly everything, and then it resolves, and you're somewhere else. Just like that, somewhere else. We came out of transit approximately 40 million kilometers from the Concordance hub station that translated as central waypoint of the third settled rim, and which the crew had universally decided to call the hub because that was what it was. And I stood at that viewport, and I saw it. The hub was, I don't have a word that works. It was enormous in a way that scale doesn't quite capture. It was a structure that had been built and rebuilt and expanded for 6 centuries, and you could see the different architectural signatures of different member species layered over and into each other like sediment, like something geological. It was lit from within by running lights in colors I didn't have names for. It was surrounded by ships, dozens, maybe hundreds at various distances, in shapes that bore no resemblance to anything we'd designed, coming from engineering traditions we'd never encountered. It was the busiest, most impossibly complex, most genuinely alien thing I had ever looked at. And none of it, not one beam or panel or running light, had been available to us during the 15 years we needed it most. I stood there for a long time. 8 came up beside me. His ridge went to a deep, quiet amber. "You are thinking about something specific," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm thinking about how long it took us to get here," I said. "By transit time standards, your arrival was." "Not that kind of long," I said. He was quiet for a moment, then no. "I suppose not." The formal reception at the hub was everything that careful interspecies diplomacy looked like when 47 species had been practicing it for 600 years. It was elaborate and slow and full of protocols within protocols. There were arrival acknowledgement ceremonies and gift exchanges that weren't gifts so much as symbolic objects representing category concepts. Earth's delegation had prepared ours with the help of a small army of cultural anthropologists and concordant standard linguists. And there were introductory meals where 3/4 of what was served was theoretically consumable by humans and actually consumable by about half the species present. I ate something that tasted like cardamom and regret and was apparently a delicacy among the Doscam. I smiled and said it was excellent. The Doscam looked pleased. They were small, round, covered in fine copper-colored hair, and had 7 fingers on each of their 4 hands. They were also, I had been briefed, among the most technically advanced members of the Concordance, with atmospheric management systems that had been operational for roughly 400 years. I ate the cardamom and regret thing and smiled. VI. On the second day, there was a formal session in what the hub called its assembly spiral, a hall that curved upward in a way that accommodated the different size and environmental requirements of various species, each delegation seated in their own adjusted alcove, with a central floor space that could be reconfigured for whoever was addressing the assembly. Earth's delegation was addressed first. The Concordance's senior diplomatic marshal, a Velhari named something that translated as long record of considered decisions, who everyone on our team had privately started calling the marshal, delivered a formal welcome. It was beautiful, honestly. It was kind and historically situated, and it acknowledged Earth's achievement in a way that was genuinely respectful. And then the marshal said something that I had been waiting for. The Concordance recognizes that Earth's path to this moment was taken without assistance from member species. This is not, as some of your people have suggested, a failure of Concordance values. It is, rather, evidence of them. The protocol exists because experience has taught us that premature technological assistance creates dependency rather than capability. Earth is here today, before this assembly, having developed genuine capability. The protocol worked as intended. Silence. Not angry silence, just the silence of 22 humans absorbing what had just been said. Captain Okonkwo was seated 3 positions to my left. I couldn't see her face from where I was sitting, but I saw her hands, which were folded on the table in front of her, and I saw them tighten very slightly. Our lead diplomat, Ambassador Takeshi Mori, rose to respond. I want to say that what he said in that moment was some great speech, some piece of oratory that rang through the assembly spiral and changed something. What he actually said was, "The Concordance's welcome is received with genuine gratitude. Earth looks forward to exploring what partnership means across our respective histories." It was careful and diplomatic, and exactly right for the setting. But that night, in the human delegation's assigned quarters, a set of rooms near the hub's outer ring, atmospheric controls adjusted to something close to Earth standard, the lighting slightly off in a way that made everyone look slightly unwell. We sat around a table, and someone opened a bottle of whiskey that had been transported across however many light years, because of course someone had packed whiskey, and we talked. Really talked. Not for the record, not in Concordance standard. Ambassador Mori poured the first glass and looked at it for a moment. "The protocol worked as intended," he repeated. "It did work," said Dr. Cressida Huang, our chief science liaison, who was also the person who'd packed the whiskey. "We did develop genuine capability. He's not wrong about that." "He's not wrong," Mori agreed, "and he's also not accounting for what it cost." Nobody argued with that. I thought about the distribution centers, about Feride's tired eyes, about my mother. "So what do we do with it?" asked Lieutenant Commander Yusuf Dantata, who handled our navigation and had grown up in a coastal city that didn't look the same anymore. Nobody had a clean answer. "We drank the whiskey." VII. On the 3rd day, I met Thesson alone. This wasn't planned. It happened in one of the hub's corridor spaces, long, curving passages that connected the various sections, lined with what I can only describe as ambient documentation. Visual displays that shifted and changed, showing images and data from across the Concordance's member worlds. Landscapes, species, moments. Thesson was standing in front of one of the displays when I came around the curve. She was looking at a section that showed Earth. I stopped. She was one of the 3 Velhari who had come with us as diplomatic escorts, and she was the youngest of the 3, though Velhari aging showed differently than human aging, and young for a Velhari meant something like 60 by human years. She had the pale feathering and forward-tilted eyes of her species, and she moved in that particular gliding way that Velhari had, like they were conserving energy out of principle. She turned when she heard me. "Observer Kerv," she said, my name or near enough. They always slightly softened the consonants. "Thesson," I nodded at the display. "Earth." "I was reviewing the atmospheric recovery models," she said. "The rate of stabilization achieved by your microbial sequestration method it exceeded our projections from the early period." "Our projections were a little more motivated," I said. The words came out flatter than I intended. I saw something shift in her expression, a small adjustment, the kind that read as acknowledgement. She said, "I want to tell you something that is not an official concordance position." I looked at her. "There were debates," she said. "During your climate crisis period, members of the Protocol Review Council, including several Velhari, raised formal objections to the non-intervention policy as applied to Earth's situation. They argued that atmospheric management assistance did not constitute the type of technological transfer the protocol was designed to restrict." I was quiet. "The objections were heard," she continued. "They were not successful. The majority position held that any technological transfer created the dependency problem, regardless of category." "How many species voted against intervention?" 31. "And how many voted for?" 16. So 16 species had tried. 16 out of 47 had looked at what was happening to Earth and said, "This is wrong, we should help." And 31 had said, "Protocol." I stood with that for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Thesson's feathers shifted, a very slight movement that I'd learned corresponded to what might be called discomfort, or perhaps honesty. "Because I was in that chamber," she said. "I was a junior observer, I had no vote. But I was in that chamber and I watched, and I have thought about it since." She looked back at the display, Earth rotating, blue and white and brown in places that had been more green once. "I thought you should know," she said, "that it was not unanimous." I told Aid about the conversation later that evening. He was in the space the S-Ratha used for what passed as rest, a low-lit room with humid air and a floor that was soft in a way that felt biological. He let me in without surprise, which I was starting to understand was just his baseline. He listened, his ridge stayed amber through the whole account. When I finished, he said, "Does it help, knowing it was not unanimous?" I thought about it honestly. "I don't know," I said. "Ask me in a few years." He flickered blue-green, amused but gently. "Humans always answer time-sensitive questions with time," he said. "We've had a lot of practice," I said. VIII. The formal membership candidacy hearings began on the 4th day. I won't walk you through every session. There were 17 of them over 6 days, covering everything from trade frameworks to mutual defense agreements to the question of how Earth's vote weight in assembly proceedings would be calculated during the candidacy period versus full membership. What I want to tell you about is Session 9. Session 9 was the one that wasn't on the agenda. It started the way most of the unscripted moments start, with a question from the floor. The assembly had a structure for this, a specific protocol for member species to raise additional topics, and it was used rarely because the concordance ran on prepared documentation. The species that raised Session 9 was a member called the Oreth, small, crystalline structured, representing a world called something-something Teutonal click that the hub's translation system rendered as refractive shore. The Oreth had been in the concordance for approximately 200 years and were known primarily for their work in materials science. Their representative rows, or rather their delegation speaker rose. Orith were communal speakers, 2 or 3 of them often sharing the floor simultaneously, their voices layering, and they said, "The Orith delegation would like to raise a matter of historical acknowledgement regarding the planet Earth and its pre-candidacy period." The Marshal acknowledged them. The Orith speaker said, "During the period of Earth's climate crisis, the Orith World Congress voted in favor of protocol modification to allow atmospheric assistance. This vote was overruled by the majority. The Orith delegation has since reviewed the Earth recovery data and wishes to formally acknowledge that the refusal to assist resulted in quantifiable harm. We offer this acknowledgement as part of our formal record." The assembly got very quiet. Our delegation, I watched them, went completely still. Then a second voice joined from the floor. A DOSCAM speaker, the copper-haired 7-fingered ones. The DOSCAM Confederation echoes the acknowledgement offered by the Orith delegation. We voted in favor of modification. We have carried the weight of the outcome. Then a third, a Velhari subdelegation, different from the Marshal's core group. The Velhari Conclave of Secondary Worlds offers a formal acknowledgement in alignment with the above. Then a fourth, then a fifth. I sat there counting. By the time the floor was done, 14 species had offered formal acknowledgements. Not apologies, the Concordance's diplomatic language had a distinction, and these were categorized as acknowledgements of consequence, which carried weight without the specific legal implications of formal apology. But they were offered openly, on the record, in front of the full assembly. I looked at Ambassador Mori. He was looking at the floor, very still. I thought he might be counting the same thing I was. 14 out of 47. Not most, not a majority. But 14 species who looked at our file and said, "We know what happened and we want to say so." IX. Something shifted after that session. Subtle, the kind of shift you feel before you can articulate it. The candidacy proceedings continued, but the texture changed. More members of various delegations sought informal conversations with Earth's team. More questions were asked directly, not through official channels, but in the corridor spaces, in the shared meal areas, in the places where the diplomatic protocols relaxed enough for something more like actual exchange. I had a conversation with a Velhari named Korik III, the third designated in a Velhari family collective, which had implications I didn't fully understand, who was a junior science minister for something called the Velhari Inner Worlds Compact. We talked for almost 3 hours. He knew about the UEPL. He knew about Dr. Vass. He had apparently read everything publicly available about the drive development process. "The mathematics," he said. "The energy compression model your Dr. Vass developed. We don't have an exact parallel in our own FTL architecture. The approach is different." "Different how?" I asked. "Ours was developed with reference to the DOSCAM framework. We adapted from something that existed. Dr. Vass developed from first principles." "She had too," I said. "I know," he said. "That's what makes it different." He paused. "There may be applications," he said carefully. "In transit efficiency across long distances, applications that our current framework doesn't address well. I mention this only as a theoretical observation." I understood what he was doing. He was opening a door very carefully, very correctly, in a way that preserved the protocol's dignity, while acknowledging that the conversation we were about to have was going to be a different kind of conversation than the Concordance usually had with developing worlds. "It's an interesting theoretical observation," I said. He flickered. "Velhari don't exactly smile, but there's a thing they do with the inner edge of their eye covering that's close," and we kept talking. I called my mother from the hub. The transit delay on a signal from here to Earth was approximately 11 minutes each way, so it wasn't really a conversation. I sent her a message, and she sent one back, and we left space for the lag. I told her where I was. I told her what had happened in Session 9. She replied, 22 minutes later, me sitting in my quarters watching the timestamp count down, and she said, "Your grandfather would say this. He would say, the ones who eventually look you in the eye and say, 'I know what I did and didn't do,' that's worth something. Not everything, but something." Then a pause, then, "Come home soon. The garden needs help, and I've started making the old lentil soup again, the one you like. I made too much." I sat with that for a while. The stars outside my viewport were stars I'd never had names for, at distances I couldn't have reached 2 years ago, and somewhere 22 minutes ago, which was also right now, more or less. Depending on how you wanted to think about time, my mother had made too much soup. I don't know why that hit me the way it did. I think it was just the specificity of it. The soup, the garden, the ordinary thing that was still happening, still exactly itself on the other side of everything we'd crossed. On day 8 of the hub visit, the last day before the Kestrel unmarked would begin its transit prep for the return, there was a session I hadn't been briefed on. Captain Okonkwo pulled me into a small conference room at 600 hours, which was not a normal hour for things to happen here. She looked like she'd been awake for a while. "Sit down, Kerv," she said. I sat. "We've had a proposal," she said. "Informal, off the agenda, it came through 8, actually." 8? I hadn't known 8 was involved in anything off agenda. He's S-Rath. Their information brokering role in the Concordance is older than some of the member species' formal membership. He's more networked than his navigator liaison title suggests. I filed that away for later. "What's the proposal?" I asked. "A joint research initiative," she said. "Cordially worded, voluntary. The Velhari Inner Worlds Compact, the Orath, and the Doskem, the 3 most technically relevant to Earth-specific situation, are proposing a formal shared research framework. Not technology transfer. A framework, joint development. Both sides contribute, both sides publish." "Under what auspices?" "Outside the protocol. The protocol applies to pre-FTL civilizations. We're no longer that. This would be standard Concordance intermember research collaboration, the same framework they use with each other." I looked at her. "That's a different thing than being told to ask for help," I said. "It is," she said. "It's also, and I want you to think about this carefully, partly about us having something they want. The compression model. Korak 3 isn't the only one who's noticed," she said. "Apparently the long-distance transit efficiency implications are significant. They've been working on the problem for 40 years without a solution that matches what Dr. Vass stumbled into by necessity." I sat with that. Stumbled into by necessity. Because we didn't have any other options. Because 47 species had watched, through their very careful and ethical and ultimately costly protocol, and we had no other options. And in the brutal particular narrowness of having no other options, Dr. Vass had found something they hadn't. "What does Ambassador Mori think?" I asked. "He thinks it's the right move," she said. "He also thinks we shouldn't accept it as though we're grateful for the permission." "How do we accept it, then?" Okonkwo looked at me for a moment. There was something in her expression that was hard to read, not quite pride, not quite resolution, something that lived between the two. "We accept it as equals," she said, "which is what we are now." "Xi." I had one more conversation before we left. It was with the Marshal, the Velhari senior diplomatic marshal, long record of considered decisions, and I did not expect it. He requested it, which surprised me, because the Marshal communicated almost entirely through official channels and official statements. We met in a small room off one of the secondary corridors. No aides, no translators. I was one of the humans who spoke passable Concordance standard, and he spoke it natively, so we were fine. He was older than I'd initially estimated. Velhari feathering thins at the edges in age, and his was thin in ways I hadn't noticed in the larger formal settings. He said, "I want to address something I said in the assembly." "The protocol statement," I said. "Yes," he was quiet for a moment. "I want to say, for my record, not for any official purpose, that the statement was accurate, and that accurate is not always sufficient." I waited. "The protocol worked as designed," he said. "You develop genuine capability without dependency. This is what the protocol exists to produce. I believe this. I have believed it for a long time." A pause. "I also spent 3 years on the Protocol Review Council during your climate crisis period. I voted with the majority." I looked at him. "I would like you to know," he said carefully, "that I have reviewed that period extensively since, and that the data on human casualties during the thermal cascade years is present in my record. I read it. I hold it." He said it the way someone says something they've been carrying. Not an apology. Not quite. In Concordance Standard, there are specific forms for apology, and this was not one of them. But it was something. It was a very old, very senior member of the species that had basically founded the system that had watched us bleed, sitting in a small room, telling me that he had read the numbers, that the numbers lived somewhere in him. I didn't know what to say. I said the thing I actually thought, which was, "Thank you for saying that." He dipped his head. A Velhari gesture I'd learned indicated acknowledgement without agreement or disagreement. "Your species," he said, "has handled this process with more, grace is not quite the word, with more steadiness than I expected." "We've had practice," I said, "being steady when we're also angry." He looked at me. Something moved in those forward-tilted eyes. "Yes," he said, "I imagine you have." XII. We left the hub on day 9. The departure ceremony was shorter than the arrival. The Concordance had a different ceremonial weighting for arrivals and departures, arrivals being considered the more significant moment. We exchanged the formal departure objects, made the formal departure statements in Concordance Standard, and then we were on the Kestrel unmarked, and the hub was falling away behind us. I watched it until it was small. Then I turned away from the viewport and went to find 8. He was in one of the transit prep rooms, monitoring the drive initialization from a console that had been configured for Esrathi limb placement. His ridge was amber calm. "Going home," I said. "Going home," he agreed. 8, I said, "Did you broker the joint research proposal?" He flickered blue-green, deep, amused, absolutely not apologetic. "The Esrathi role in the Concordance Information Network is a matter of public record," he said. "That's not an answer," I said. "The proposal emerged from conversations that I may have facilitated," he said, "in the way that information sharing tends to facilitate things." I looked at him. "Why?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. His ridge went from blue-green to something deeper, a blue-purple I hadn't seen before, which I didn't have a read on. "I observed your species for 11 years, he said. "From the porch, as you call it, in various observer roles." He paused. "I watched the climate years. I watched the food distribution crises. I watched the UEPL development process. I have a very detailed record. And I thought," he said, "that when you arrived here, when you inevitably arrived here, because I was quite certain you would, it would be correct for the Concordance to do something other than simply say welcome. We always knew you'd make it." He flickered again, amber again, steady. "It seemed," he said, "like the minimum." I thought about that word, minimum, the minimum they could do after everything, the opening of a door, a joint research framework, 14 formal acknowledgements. It was not everything. It was not even close to everything. But it was a beginning. The particular kind of beginning that comes after a long, complicated period that nobody gets to rewind. "Yeah," I said, "it is." The transit back to Earth took 9 hours subjectively, and was, if anything, stranger than the first. I spent most of it at the viewport again, watching the non-space of transit, which looked like nothing and looked like everything, which I was told by the physicists would take years to fully describe and would probably still be inadequately described when they finished. I thought about my grandfather in his chair. The ones who leave you alone when you're bleeding are never the ones you forget. He was right, we hadn't forgotten, we weren't going to forget. But the thing about the ones who leave you alone, the thing my grandfather never said, maybe because he died before he got the chance, is that what you do with it matters. You can carry it as a wound, forever, and wounds that don't close don't stop costing you. Or you can carry it as a record, as information about what you were and what you survived and what you're capable of now. And then you move forward, not because the past was acceptable, it wasn't, but because the future has more people in it who need you to be present, and you can't be fully present if you're still standing in the distribution center of 15 years ago. Earth had come to the hub as a candidate. Earth was going home as something different, not a member yet, but on its way. And it was going home having made, in the careful diplomatic language of a 600-year-old interstellar coalition, a beginning. The joint research framework would take time to structure. The membership candidacy would take years. The relationship between Earth and the Concordance, Between humanity and 47 other species who had watched us from across a line they'd drawn for good and insufficient reasons. That relationship would take a generation, probably, to become something that felt like genuine partnership. But it had started, and it had started with us whole, with us capable, with us having arrived as equals, bringing something they hadn't expected, walking into that assembly spiral on our own 2 feet, and however many other feet we collectively had. The ones who stayed, you repay them with everything. My grandfather was talking about humans when he said that, about the small loyalties, the neighbors who showed up with food when someone was sick, the friends who stayed through the hard years, the ordinary human practice of remembering who was there. But I thought, sitting in that viewport with transit space doing its impossible thing around the Kestrel unmarked, that maybe there was a version of it that applied here too. Maybe repaying everything didn't always mean having an account to settle. Maybe sometimes it meant arriving at the place where the ones who watched you bleed were waiting, and showing up with your head clear, and your capability intact, and your hand extended. Not forgetting, not pretending, but extending the hand. Epilogue excerpt. When we came back into normal space, Earth was visible within about 40 minutes of transit emergence. We were far out. The transit exit point was calibrated for safety, well outside the orbital range, and Earth was small. Smaller than I expected, smaller than the photographs. Lieutenant Commander Dantata called it up on the main display for everyone who wanted to see. The whole crew gathered. 22 people crowded around a display showing a small blue-white sphere that they had each individually crossed an impossible distance to leave, and were now crossing it again to return to. Nobody said anything for a while. Captain Okonkwo stood at the edge of the group, arms crossed, looking at Earth the way you look at something you almost can't believe you're seeing. Then she said, very quietly, so that only the people right near her could hear, "We're going to need a bigger fleet." Not a military statement, a logistics statement, a what comes next statement, because she was already thinking about what happens after the beginning, about the 100 things that came after you showed up in an assembly spiral and extended your hand. It was the most Captain Okonkwo thing she could have said. I wrote it down. I write things down. It's a habit. I think if you're going to be part of something, something that stretches the definition of what part means across light years and years of time, you owe it to whoever comes after you to leave some kind of record. So here is mine. Here is what I want them to know. We were left alone when we were bleeding. And we didn't close up and harden and stop caring about what was outside our own wound. We kept working. We kept building. We found the thing they hadn't found because we were forced into a narrowness of necessity that produced a new direction. And then we went out into the galaxy. Not with a grudge carried like a weapon. With a record carried honestly. And a hand extended. And too much lentil soup waiting at home.